I came off the airplane a couple days ago, so my ears are a little clogged. I didn't really hear what you guys said. Let's try that one more time. Ahoy! Okay, much better. So first, I want to say a big thank you to Microsoft for inviting me here. I'm really excited to share some of the ideas and thoughts with you. And I'm also especially excited because my wife was able to join me on this trip, so thank you for coming with me. Now, a lot of my time is spent working with and advising and researching organizations to understand what the future of work is going to look like. So I spend a lot of time working with these organizations, and recently I released a book called The Future of Work, which is the orange one up there. And so I'm going to share some of these different insights and ideas from that book. Now, before I get started, I should point out that a lot of what I want to share with you isn't just stuff that I have made up. It's not just stuff that I found online. It's actually what some of the world's most forward-thinking organizations in the world are telling me they are doing. Now, I run something called the Future of Work Community, FOWcommunity.com. And these, you can see, are some of the organizations that participate in that community. And they tell me what they're thinking about, what they're worried about, what their fears are, what keeps them up at night. So some of what I want to share with you today comes directly from these organizations. So I just want to acknowledge them and give them a big thank you for sharing these thoughts with me. Now, we should always ask, why are we here? I mean, why are we at this type of a conference? Why are we at this event? I mean, it's not just for us to hang out and eat good food and sit in chairs, right? There's something going on. So why are we here? And the reason we're here is because we're all seeing change, right? We're all seeing change in our organizations, in our personal lives. Everywhere we look, there's nothing but change. And oftentimes people ask, why is the change that we're seeing now different than the change that we have seen years ago? And there are a couple of reasons for why change today is different than change that we have seen at any other time during the world. And the three reasons are, the first, we live in a connected world. Never before have we lived in a connected world where when change happens in one place, it can happen everywhere. First time. The second reason why change is so important today is because of the pace of change. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But the speed of change is so fast. It's never been this fast before. And the third reason is around disruption. Every company in the world, regardless of how small you are or how big you are, is at risk for disruption. And so what we need to think about is, are you going to disrupt, or are you going to be the one that's disrupted? And from the research and the work that I'm doing in the companies that I sort of advise, I've never seen a greater opportunity than now for organizations to really start to think about and explore what the future of work is going to look like. I've never seen a better opportunity than now. Now, a lot of times people say, why are you interested in the future of work? How did you get involved in this? And it's an interesting story because after I graduated college years ago, I got a double degree in business management economics and psychology. And I was so excited. I was going to join the corporate world. I was going to have a good job. I would stay there for a couple years, go back, get my MBA, and then go back and work for a fun company. And so I interviewed for my first job in Los Angeles. And they say, we're so excited to have you. You're going to go on all sorts of trips. You're going to do business development. You're going to meet great people. And I said, perfect, that's exactly what I want. And a couple months into my job, I'm doing PowerPoint presentations, data entry, cold calling, right? That's not what I signed up for. One day, the CEO comes out of his big office and he says, Jacob, I have a really important meeting with somebody. Here's $10. Can you go to Starbucks and get me a cup of coffee? And after that happened, I realized that there's something very wrong with the way that our organizations are structured and with the way that we think about management and leadership and technology. So ever since that happened, I've been exploring what the future of work is going to look like. Now, this is a question that I always like to ask, right? When you think about the future of work, what comes into your mind? And a lot of people say things like millennials, technology, big data, wearables, flexible work. And these are all very, very relevant themes. But the challenge is, how often do organizations actually think about how we work? I mean, we spend a lot of time thinking about technology. We spend a lot of time thinking about supply chain, about marketing, about our customers. Right? We spend a lot of time thinking about all these things. But how often do our organizations actually sit and think about how the workplace is changing? What does the future of work actually look like? And why is it starting to look like that? And so that's some of what I want to share with you today. The 5 trends that are shaping the future of work. Now, this is a cartoon that I found that I think very accurately reflects what we're seeing within a lot of our organizations around the world. And for those of you that can't read it, it says our biggest challenge is the time zone difference. In New York, it's 2:45, but at our headquarters, it's 1974. And a lot of people always feel like this. A lot of people feel like the pace of change is so great, but our organizations are so far behind. Why is that? In fact, this is what most people think of our work week, right? Monday morning blues, terrible Tuesdays, hump day Wednesday, thirsty Thursday, and on Friday, everybody is so happy. Does anybody want to guess, out of every day during the week, what day do you think people get the most heart attacks? If you had to pick one day from Monday to Friday, when do people, do you think, get the most heart attacks? What was that? Tuesday? Monday. I hear a couple people saying Monday. Monday is right. Most people get the heart attacks on Monday because after the weekend, they are so stressed out and so scared to go back to work that they get a heart attack. Right? This is the world that we live in. Now, in doing research for the book, I thought I would explore some very basic concepts. What is a manager? What is an employee? What is work? And so I started to go through the dictionary and look up definitions, and I was very surprised by what I found. So this is the definition from the dictionary of what a manager is. If you look at the words in white, these are synonyms for the word manager. In other words, when we think of a manager, we think of a slave driver, a boss, a zookeeper. Right? This is actually in the dictionary. This is ingrained in how we build and structure our organizations. With this idea that a manager is a slave driver and a zookeeper. Basically, this is supposed to be our manager. Right? This is the stereotypical idea of what everybody thinks about when we think of a manager. But what about an employee? What is an employee? Again, this is from the dictionary. Cog, servant, a slave. I can't make this up. This is actually what we refer to in how we think about employees within our organizations. Basically, an employee looks like this guy. Right? This is what we think about when we think about the stereotypical employee. They're expendable. They're just a cog in the machine. And my favorite one is when we look at what is work. And when we think of work, most people think of the daily grind, of drudgery, of struggle, of all these really horrible negative things. So if you put these 3 words together, we're all just cogs working for a slave driver as we go about our daily drudgery. Wow, work really sucks. But we're starting to see some very fascinating changes happen. Now, one of the reasons why a lot of organizations are struggling today is because of this. Right? The pace of work is evolving at a very rapid pace. The world is changing, right? Technologies are changing, behaviors are changing. The world of work is evolving very, very fast. But the trouble is that our organizations have a very hard time keeping up with the pace of change. And the bigger the gap gets between where the world of work is and where our organizations are, the more disengaged our employees start to become. And I see this time and time again. And all the organizations that are part of the community tell me this exact same thing. We have to be able to close that gap. And so I mentioned that we're starting to see these changes happen, but why is change happening? Well, there are a couple things that we're starting to see. So the first is, if we look at how organizations always used to operate, it used to be very top-down. The people at the top make all the rules. They tell you where to work, how to dress, who you should work with, what technologies you should use, when to come into work. Right? All these things started at the top and were pushed down. But now we're starting to see some of this coming from the bottom up. The employees are sharing their own technologies, their own expectations, their own ideas, their own values. And organizations have to adapt. And some of you might be thinking, why? Why does an organization need to change? Well, because if you don't, you won't be able to attract and retain top talent. We're starting to see what employees value and care about today. And it's very different than what they cared about 20 years ago. And so if your company doesn't change, you're going to have a very hard time bringing in this top talent into your company. Now, when we think about the future of work, I think there are two words that sum up the future of work very, very well. And that is challenge convention. So think about all the standard ideas and processes and ways of working and think differently about all of it. And we have to think differently about all of it because we've always had a very big assumption around why organizations exist. You know, if you were to look back 30, 40, 50, 60 plus years ago, organizations existed and they could do whatever they wanted because they knew that employees needed to work there. Right? You all have bills, you have mortgages, you have kids, you have car payments, you have things that you need to spend money on. And so you have to work for an organization. You need to work for an organization. It's the only way that we can live. But that's not true anymore. It's not true anymore. Look at what we're starting to see. You can rent out your apartment on Airbnb. You can become an Uber or a Lyft driver. You can become a freelancer and create a platform on something like Odesk or Elance. You can use a site like Etsy and create your own products and sell them and distribute them to other people around the world. You can go work for a startup. You can go raise money on a site like Indiegogo or GoFundMe. And so organizations are no longer the only place we need to be a part of. And so what does that mean for our companies? The war for talent has never been fiercer. Every organization around the world is fighting for talent. And the big assumption that we've made is that we need to work for organizations. But what organizations are starting to realize is they have to create an environment where people want to work there, not where they need to work there. So that's a big shift that we're starting to see. So why is this shift happening, right? Why is this shift happening? Why is it happening now? That's the 5 trends shaping the future of work. And that's where I want to spend the rest of my time before I answer some of your questions. So these are the 5 trends shaping the future of work. Everything that I talked about, all the changes that we're starting to see happening because of these 5 things. So let's start with the first one, new behaviors. What do I mean when I say new behaviors? Well, if I were to find anyone here 10 years ago and find you on the street and say, you know what? One day, I'm going to know everything about you. I'll know the movies that you like. I'll know the restaurants that you go to. I'll know your entire professional history. I'll know your thoughts and your ideas. You would think that I'm crazy. But look at the world that we live in now. Everybody has a LinkedIn profile. Everybody shares information on Facebook or Twitter. Right? We live in a very public world where we share information. Everything has opened up in our personal lives. So we see new behaviors around communication, around collaboration, around learning, around education. All of these new behaviors are pushing their way inside of our companies. And so it's forcing organizations to think differently about what it means to work. So that's the first big trend, new behaviors. The second big trend that we're seeing is around technology. Now, the best way to understand how technology is impacting us is by looking at chess. Chess is something that I love. My grandmother taught me how to play chess when I was very young, and so I always had a deep passion for chess. And 1,000 years ago, or so the story goes, chess was invented by a mathematician and an inventor named Sissa. And Sissa invented chess, and he shows it to the ruler of the land, and he says, look, I've created this game chess. And the ruler of the land, the king, looks at it and he says, wow, this is amazing. I want to give you a reward. You can pick anything you want. Anything you want at all. I'll build you a huge palace. I'll give you horses, camels. You pick anything you want, it's yours. And Sissa thought about it for a minute, and he said, okay, here's what I want. I want you to take 1 grain of rice and put it on the first square of the chessboard. I want you to take 2 grains of rice and put it on the second square. And keep doubling it from the first square all the way until you get to the end. So 64 squares. So 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. Double it until you get all the way to the end. And the king thought about it for a little bit, and he said, that's it? That's all you want? I can give you anything in the entire world, and you just want some rice? And Sissa says, yep, that's all I want. Just give me some rice. And the king says, okay, fine. He calls over his servants, and he says, figure out how much rice this is going to be, and just pay this guy off. And so the servants go away for a couple days, and they come back, and they tell the king how much rice this is. And the king's jaw drops to the floor. It turns out there isn't even this much rice today in the entire world. It would be a Mount Everest made out of rice. It doesn't exist. And so the story goes that Sissa then became the new king. Or there's an alternate version where the king got so upset that he chopped the head off of Sissa. But we'll stick with the first one instead. Now, what's the point of this story? The point of this story is that when you get to the second half of the square, the second half of the chessboard, the growth becomes exponential. In other words, the growth is no longer just linear, it goes straight up. And many technologists and futurists and these organizations around the world believe that that's where we are today. Today we are at the second half of the chessboard, where growth is exponential. It's no longer just linear, it's straight up. And that's a big challenge for a lot of our organizations. Now, there are a lot of technologies out there in the world. There are a lot of technologies that organizations are thinking about, a lot of technologies that organizations are using. Some of them were mentioned today. Right? We have the Internet of Things. We have wearable devices, like the one I have on my wrist, a smartwatch. We have the cloud, big data, the Internet of Things, collaboration platforms, robots and automation, all of these amazing new technologies that are entering our organizations. And they're completely changing how we work, why we work, where we work, and what the purpose of getting our jobs is, what the purpose of getting these jobs done is. Now, here's an interesting chart that was put out not too long ago, which looks at how data is growing. And some of you might not be able to read it in the back, but afterwards I'll be here for a bit and I'm happy to talk about it with you. And this just shows the amount of growth in data that we're seeing. To give you some perspective, in 2011, the entire world created around 1.8 zettabytes. That is equivalent to everybody in the entire world getting 200 million high-definition MRI scans every day. That's equivalent to taking 32 gig iPads, filling them up with information, and building the Great Wall of China, but twice the height. This was 2011. Look at the projections that we're starting to see for 2020. And that gives you some idea of where we're going. This is in 5 years. We're seeing 30 times that amount of data and information. So big data, as you can see, is a very fascinating and hot topic and trend that a lot of organizations are thinking about. Another one that I'm really passionate about is the Internet of Things. I love the Internet of Things because, like I said, I have a smartwatch, I have other products that connect to each other and talk to each other. And this is some of the projections that we're starting to see, right? By 2020, around 50 billion connected devices around the world. And these are conservative numbers. Other numbers say that this is going to be 100 billion, 200 billion. So the Internet of Things is another piece of technology that we're seeing that's really impacting our organizations. Now, just to give you something fun to think about, here's something that a company called Libelium created, and it's called a smart world. And it gives you an idea of how the Internet of Things comes into play in our world and how we live. And I think this is something that we're going to see everywhere, 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. Right? Sensors put in everything that can automate and manage and control everything about how we work, how we live. If you want to get really thinking about the future, there is a company or website called 2045.com that's already thinking about creating human avatars. within the next 25 years. That's crazy. So this just gives you some perspective and idea of how fast technology is changing. I mean, we're talking about creating a human brain in the next 20, 25 years. So technology is really changing fast. And we're already starting to see this happen within our organizations. Now, the next big trend that we're seeing, part of technology, is around robots and automation. And we already start to see this in our personal lives, right? When you go to the bank now, you go to a machine. When you go to check out groceries, you go to a machine. When you go to the airport to check in for your flight, you go to a machine. So we're starting to see robots and automation impact our lives more and more and more. Now I just want to show you or walk you through what some of these things are. The one on the top right, it's an exoskeleton. It's something that workers can wear to lift 10 times the amount of weight. The top left, this is what Amazon and a lot of organizations that have big warehouses are using. They have hundreds of robots all over the warehouse floor. And these robots use sensors, and they move around the warehouse, they pick up the shelf, they bring it to a person, the person takes out what they need, puts it in a box, and ships it to you. Right? So robots are already everywhere. The bottom left, we're seeing a robot that's already being used in manufacturing to assemble parts and to put things together. And they have these really weird-looking human eyes. In the bottom right, we're starting to see robots that are already being used in restaurants to cook your food. I was at an airport not too long ago. I went to a restaurant, I sat down, there was no human. I ordered my food on an iPad, and the only time I even saw a person was when they just brought the food out. I paid through the iPad, everything is done through the iPad. So we can see that technology is really having a huge impact in how we work and how we live, and it's something that a lot of organizations are starting to think about. Now the next big trend that we're seeing is around millennials. This is something that a lot of organizations are worried about and thinking about constantly. And there's good reason for that. By 2020, millennials are expected to be 50% of the workforce. 50% of your workforce is going to be millennials. We're talking 5 years. That's not a lot of time. By 2025, millennials are supposed to be 75% of the workforce. That's huge. That's a huge, huge number. This is what we're starting to see, at least in the United States, and from what I've seen around the world, the numbers aren't that different. But we can start to see how big of an impact millennials are going to start having on our organizations. They are going to be by far the dominant player within our organizations. Now, millennials are fascinating because they have new attitudes and values and expectations and ways of working. But at the same time, I always tell organizations, if you were to get rid of every millennial within your company, you still have plenty of other employees that care about flexible work, meaningful work, compensation, working with managers that they get along with, using relevant technologies. Right? This isn't just a millennial thing. But the reason why so much emphasis is placed on millennials is because they are going to be the dominant workforce over the next few years. And they're forcing a lot of organizations to change. Because when we think about attracting and retaining top talent, a lot of that talent is going to be these guys. It's going to be millennials. And millennials don't know what it's like to commute an hour and a half to and from work. They don't know what it's like to sit in a cubicle, to work a 9 to 5, to use legacy technologies, right? It's foreign. It's something that a lot of millennials are not familiar with. Now, a couple other things to think about millennials. It costs on average $24,000 to replace every millennial that you have. $24,000. 69% of millennials believe that attendance in your office is not required or not necessary on a regular basis. So we're really starting to see that these are new values and attitudes and expectations and ways of working. But like I said, it's not just about millennials. What I see from the organizations that I work with is that the future employee isn't about how old you are. You could be 22, you could be 52, you can be 62. The future of work and the future employee doesn't care how old you are. It only matters what your expectations are. It's in your head, your values, your behaviors. how you expect and how you want to get your job done. That's what the future of work is about. It's not about age. Now, the next big trend that we're seeing is around mobility. A couple years ago, a friend of mine, we went to China for a month. Not for work, just for fun. And we went to all the major provinces in China, Beijing, Shanghai, Yunnan. And in one of the provinces that we went to, we thought it would be really fun to rent bikes and just bike in the middle of nowhere, just see where we end up. And so we rented bikes, we took some food, we took some water with us, and we biked out in the middle of nowhere. For hours, we just biked and biked and biked until we got into the middle of nowhere. We stopped to get some water. It's a beautiful day, 70 degrees. Everywhere you look is just huge mountains, green fields, rice paddies everywhere. And we stopped to get some water for a few minutes, and I look around and I notice not too far away from me, there's a rice paddy farmer in the middle of nowhere in a Chinese province. And I look at the rice paddy farmer, he's going about doing his chores, and he stops for a minute. And he puts his hand in his pocket and takes out a smartphone. Now, I live in San Francisco, which many people consider to be the tech and innovation hub of the world. And here we are, thousands of miles away, in the middle of nowhere, in a rice paddy field, and there is a farmer next to me that has a smartphone, which means that he has access to the same people, the same information that I do living in San Francisco. That's what mobility is about. It doesn't matter where you are. You should be able to get connected to your work, to your people, to your information, regardless of what device you're using, where you're based, what time zone you're in. None of that should matter. So that's what we think about when we think about mobility. Now, here are some statistics or some numbers around mobility that I think are really important. By 2017, half of employers are going to require employees to use their own devices for work. That was the statistics that Gartner put out. This is in 2 years. In 2013 alone, we had 406 million new smartphones that were connected. 406 million. I won't go through all the rest of the statistics, but I'll mention the bottom one here, that by 2018, we're expected to see over 10 billion connections. So mobility and smartphones are penetrating organizations around the world. Now, the fifth and final trend that we're seeing is globalization. And the best way to think about globalization is thinking about a world where boundaries of any kind do not exist. The language that you speak, the currency that you transact in, the culture that you subscribe to, where you're located, all of these things are starting to matter less and less and less and less. The whole world is just becoming like a giant city, just like a big city. And it's funny because a lot of organizations, when they used to create offices and when they used to create their central headquarters, they would always put things in places and assume that they had to bring in top talent from people that were within a certain radius, within 5, 10, 20 miles away. But now we're seeing organizations bring in top talent from anywhere in the world. I was on a conference call a couple weeks ago, 20 people on the phone in a marketing team. Everybody was in a different location from around the world. Some were working from a home office, some were working from a coffee shop, some were working from the actual office. Right? So globalization is this idea that we no longer need to operate in a world where boundaries of any kind exist. They don't. Boundaries do not exist anymore. So these are the 5 trends that are shaping the future of work. So if you ask, why are we seeing change? Why is it important for organizations to think differently? It's because of these 5 things. And these 5 things together create huge opportunity. Not just huge opportunity, but necessity. Necessity for organizations to change and think about digital transformation. Because what do you think is going to happen if your organization does nothing over the next 5 years? Where do you think these 5 trends are going to be? When millennials are already the majority of your organization, when technological change is even faster, you're not going to be in a very good place. So this is why it's imperative for organizations to change. So what do? What can we start thinking about? A lot of the organizations I've been working with are doing 3 things. Number 1, they put together teams to explore what the future of work is going to look like. These are teams that are given resources, they're given experimental capital, and they're being told, try ideas, test ideas, see what works, see what doesn't. You are like the task force within our organization to help us understand what we should be doing and what we should be thinking about. So that's number one. Put together some sort of a team that can explore what the future of work looks like at your company. Step number two is experiment. Test ideas. The organizations that can experiment and create more ideas more often are the ones that are going to win. Because that's where innovation comes from. That's where these new ideas come from. So if you experiment more and better and faster than everybody else, you're going to win. And the third thing that organizations are doing is taking those ideas, the successful ones, and replicating it across your entire company. Now, in my book on the future of work, I have a bigger framework, but unfortunately I don't have time to get through the whole thing. But these are kind of the three core things that organizations are doing. Now, ultimately, at the end of this conference, at the end of this event, the big thing that all of you need to be thinking about is, are you ready for the future of work? Are you ready for these 5 trends entering your organization? What are you doing about it? Are you just talking about it? Are you thinking about it? Or are you taking some kind of action? And that's what I want to encourage everybody to think about and to do, is to figure out what action you can take. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob. I will gonna help you a little bit to manage the Q&A.
Sure.
We have 2 microphones in the audience, one on the right, one on the left, so you can ask by that style, old style as well.
Yeah, please do. I flew 3,000 miles, so I'm expecting some good questions.
But we have, of course, the application, so I have some questions already here. So
Sure.
Let's start with the first one. Can you share what companies successfully changed their approach and what contributed to the success the most?
Oh, good question. So examples of organizations that have changed the most. There are a couple organizations out there that I think are doing a fascinating job. One of the organizations that's a part of our community is called Whirlpool. They make home appliances. They have around 80,000 employees around the world. And at Whirlpool, they had a big challenge with innovation, because innovation was always done in a silo. One team, one department. And so what they decided to do is to open up innovation to everybody within the entire organization. And they gave everybody tools, they gave everybody platforms, they gave everybody the technologies they need to be able to innovate collectively. Adobe is another good example of an organization that's doing this, right? They have Kickstarter campaigns where any employee that wants to come up with an idea, they'll give you $1,000, they'll give you a 2-day workshop, and they'll say, come up with any idea that you want. We don't care. Do anything you want with $1,000. You don't have to show us receipts. Do whatever you want. And if you come up with an idea and one executive at the company says they like your idea, they'll fund it and turn it into something more. I think that's a fantastic example of how organizations are approaching change in different ways. Those are just 2. I can give you many more. I'll be here after.
Okay. Any question from the audience? If not, let's continue with the ones submitted. Which one? This one is pretty urgent. How about Easter Monday and heart attack?
Easter Monday and heart attack. That's a good question. I don't know. I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens this Easter Monday.
Okay. So, next one. Despite all the opportunities, there is still major youth unemployment. That means that those people desperately need the job. This is giving a lot of power to the employer.
That's true. That's true. In a lot of different parts of the world, unemployment is at different levels. However, just because organizations or just because employees are working in organizations that can treat them unfairly doesn't mean that that's right. I mean, employees know, at the end of the day, sometimes we do need jobs. We have to take jobs that we maybe don't want or don't like or don't feel, don't appreciate. But that doesn't mean that these employees don't know that they deserve something better, that they want to become a part of something greater, that they should be working at an organization where they don't have to feel this way. And I think what we're going to start to see over time is this is going to shift, right? Because organizations are going to have to change if they want to be able to attract and retain this type of top talent.
Okay, let's give again the chance to audience.
Yeah,
There's one.
brave man,
Please.
there we go.
All right, so let's say you change the organization in a way that it attracts millennials. and you attract them and they come in and work for you because you have the workplace they like. How do you deal with the interaction between the millennials and the baby boomers? Do you create two different workplaces, or how do you deal with that?
Got it. Great question. So one of the things that I want to really, really stress is it's not just about millennials, right? I know I mentioned millennials because they're such a driving force within our organizations, but they aren't the only thing they're not the only generation. So as far as how you deal with it, what I found what the most successful organizations are doing, and I actually spent some time speaking with the folks at Microsoft to learn about this as well, is it's not about creating different types of workspaces. It's not about creating different approaches for different people. It's about letting the people decide and choose how they want to work and how they want to get their jobs done. Which means, if you are a millennial and you prefer to work at a coffee shop, great. If you are older and you prefer to work in an office, that's great. If you prefer to work sometimes at home, sometimes in an office, that's also great. So it's not about giving people one way or the other way, or you have two ways or you have three ways. It's about saying you pick how you want to work and how you want to get your job done. And give people that flexibility and that freedom to make those choices for themselves. So it's not about the company making the choices for the employees, it's about the employees making the choices and the organization allowing those choices to happen.
Okay?
It's one over there.
It's coming, it's coming.
It's on its way.
Within the collaborative economy, we heard a lot about the startups that are ready for taking the risk, like Lyft and others.
Yes.
Where do you see the place within those collaborative economy, sharing the assets and stuff like that, for us, more conservative companies? We are not really willing to take the risk, but I still see the collaborative economy as a big opportunity.
Sure. So for organizations that aren't willing to embrace certain changes that we're seeing, I think quite frankly, these are organizations that are going to have a lot of problems. Because part of the sharing and collaborative economy also means freelancers. It also means working with freelancers. It also means changing of employee tenure, right? So instead of employees working at your company for 5 years, 10 years, maybe they work for 1 year, for 2 years, for 6 months. So if organizations aren't willing to change to the trends that we're seeing, I don't think they're going to be around, right? How can they be? How can your organization exist in the next 5 or 10 years when the world is changing and you don't? It can't. So I think and this doesn't mean you need to invest all of your money in the sharing economy and all of your money in freelancers, but it means you need to start taking steps to think about this. So maybe instead of when you interview people and say, oh, do you want to work here for 10 years or 5 years, start to make some changes and say, look, we're going to put you on a 1-year path, and let's see what happens after 1 year. So you need to start thinking about these things and making some changes and experimenting and testing ideas. I think that's the best thing that you can do. But simply saying, we're too conservative, we're not going to do it, it's, blah, 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 that's not going to work. That's not going to work. I don't think those companies are going to exist. I really don't.
Okay, let's have one question from online. What is the biggest obstacle in organizations to adopt new way of work?
Oh, good question. So biggest obstacle for a lot of organizations, I think, is in their head. I think it's in their head. It's not technology. We have processes, we have examples of what other companies have done, we have strategies, we have frameworks, we have tactics, we have all of these different types of things. So the biggest challenge for organizations and for managers and executives is to make that switch in their head that we have to do this. Right? We have to do this. It's a behavior change. It's a mental model that a lot of organizations and managers need to realize is something that they have to do. So I think that's the biggest hurdle, right? Everything else is easy. We have everything else that's required for companies to change. I mean, there are 33 companies part of the future of work community that are all doing this, right? So I can give all of you 33 examples, at least, if not more. So the companies that don't change are the ones that are scared, they don't know what to do, they think they don't need to change. It's all in their heads. I think that's the biggest obstacle.
Okay, let's give the chance to audience again, if there is anyone.
Gentleman right there.
Yes? Okay, sorry.
Hi, I'm in IT business, but my origin is being cultural anthropologist. My question to you will be, according to your opinion, what is the ratio between active and passive people, between people who actually like to have some kind of choice and who do not like to have it, who want to be flexible and who actually want to be in as stabilized environment as possible? So what, according to you, is the adoption ratio? How many people will like to have new ways of work?
That's a good question. I can tell you that the way that we have been structuring our organizations currently doesn't work, because the numbers from Gallup show that 87% of employees around the world are not engaged in their jobs. 87%. That's most of you in this room that do not like or appreciate or don't want to be a part of the jobs that you are currently at. So clearly, something is wrong. Now, as far as how many people want flexible work and how many people don't, unfortunately, I know there have been studies and surveys on this that have been done. I don't know off the top of my head. But what I will say is that instead of thinking about flexible work versus not flexible work, and I think the gentleman previously had that question, we need to be thinking about how do we enable all types of work. So the key thing to remember with flexible work is it's a choice. It's a choice, right? You tell employees that they can decide how they work. You don't tell them you have to have flexible work. You have to come into the office. Instead, you say, look, you have a job to do just like everybody else. I don't care when you do your job. I don't care where you do your job. Just do a good job. And that's all I care about. Communicate, collaborate with your team. We're going to give you the tools, the resources. You have an office if you want it. You don't have to come in there. You, as an employee, get to choose and command how you're going to get your job done. So I think that's the important message. But I'll check to see if I can find some actual statistics around people that want flexible work that don't. I don't know off the top of my head, unfortunately.
The question really was how many people really want to have a choice. That's the problem, if they really want to have a choice.
Well, if you don't want to have a choice, then there's no problem. Then you keep doing things the way that you're doing it. But, like I said, if 87% of employees around the world are not engaged, I mean, all the companies that I work with, all the companies that I research, the number one thing that I keep hearing is employees want choice. Now, if I had to guess what number that is, I mean, I'd say 90+% from all the people that I work with and all the companies that I work with. 90+% easy. Who wouldn't want choice, right? Who wants to work in an environment where they say you have to do things like this or you can't do it at all? I don't know anybody that wants to work in that type of environment at all. Choice is about you deciding how you want to get your job done. If you want to do it the way you always used to do it, that's fine, that's your choice. But giving people that option and that flexibility, I think, is crucial.
Okay, let's use one question from online. This digital age breaks the border between private and business time of people. Don't you think it influences relationship in families? Therefore, it should be strictly separated?
That's a very good question. I actually just did an interview with somebody yesterday that was talking about work-life balance and work-life flexibility. And there's a lot that can be said about work-life balance. You know, some people call it work-life balance, some people call it work-life integration. I think there's one thing that we can all agree on. More often, we bring our work home and we bring our home to work. Right? We're seeing a mixture of the two. Now, everybody has their own definition and idea of what work-life balance is. Some people here might say, I only want to work 40 hours in an office, and then I want to go home and I don't want to think about work. Other people might say, I'm fine with working 60, 70 hours a week, but I want to work at home next to my family. If I can work at home with my family, then that's fine. That's work-life balance for me. So should the two be separate? I think it depends. What I find is that people who really don't like their jobs that much want more separation. But people who love their jobs see more of combining together. So it's personal preference. I mean, for me, I think we're starting to approach a world where it's going to be very hard to separate the two. Some companies do, a lot of them don't. I think it's personal preference. I think it's a decision that everyone here needs to make individually.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Let's give the chance to audience first. And if there is no interest, there is one interesting here, with 2 votes. Don't you think that it would be better for human being to stop this exponential growth you were talking about than to support it and accelerate it?
So do I think it's better to stop exponential growth and keep things from accelerating? No, not at all. Well, I think there are a couple things to think about. Number one, let's say you did want to stop it. What are you going to do? How are you going to stop growth? How are you going to stop change? You can't. Because somebody, somewhere in the world, is always going to be changing. So whether or not you want to change, doesn't matter. Everybody else is going to change. But I think we've also been seeing a lot of benefits from change. Right? We've seen a lot of benefits from growth and from technology. Advancements in medicine, we've seen new payment models, new ways to communicate and collaborate. Flexible work has emerged. So I think we're seeing a lot of benefits as well. But there's also a lot for us to think about as we go forward. And over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to learn a lot of things that we didn't know. And I think that's where the interesting time is going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, so thank you a lot for your answers.
Thank you.
Jacob Morgan.
Thank you, appreciate it.